I burned the blueprint on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday I understood that some things refused to stay ash. The smoke still clung to my fingers when I ran. The tunnels beneath London were not meant for women in wool skirts and ink-stained cuffs. But then again, neither was the laboratory where I had spent 18 months drawing machines I was never supposed to understand. I had been hired as a technical draftsman, nothing more. My hand was steady, my lines were clean, and I asked no questions. That was the arrangement. The Crown paid well for silence, and I needed the money more than I needed curiosity. My father had been a watchmaker before the cough took him, and he had taught me that precision was a kind of prayer. I carried that lesson into the cold stone rooms 3 levels below Whitechapel, where the air tasted of coal and copper and something sharper I could never name. The other draftsmen were men, of course. They ignored me the way one ignores furniture, and I preferred it that way. I kept my head down, copied the diagrams handed to me each morning, and returned them each evening to the locked cabinets in the supervisor's office. The blueprints were always partial, always fragmented. A valve assembly one day, a pressure gauge the next. I drew gears and pistons and strange spiral chambers that looked like nothing I had ever seen in my father's workshop. I told myself it was not my place to ask what they were building. I told myself that for a year and a half. It was the smell that broke my silence. Not the usual smell of the tunnels, the damp stone and oil and sweat of 100 men working in shifts around the clock. This was different, sweet and cloying, like ether, but wrong, like flowers rotting in a closed room. It came from the testing chamber, the one we were not allowed to enter, the one with the iron door that hissed when it opened, releasing clouds of white vapor that clung to the floor like fog on the Thames. I had walked past that door 1,000 times and never wondered what lay behind it. But that morning, the door was open. Just a crack, just enough. I should have kept walking. I should have returned to my desk and picked up my pen and drawn the next diagram in the endless series of diagrams that made up my days. But I stopped. I set down my folio. I stepped closer. Through the gap, I could see a table, leather straps, a man lying very still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Above him, suspended from the ceiling by a network of brass chains and rubber tubes, was a device I had drawn pieces of for months without understanding what they would become. A helmet of sorts, but monstrous, crowned with glass chambers filled with glowing green liquid. The chambers were connected to a central reservoir that pulsed like a heartbeat, feeding the liquid down through tubes that disappeared into the man's skull. His eyes were open. They stared at the ceiling, unblinking, and his lips moved soundlessly as if he were trying to speak but had forgotten how. A voice behind me said my name. I turned and saw Dr. Thorne, the project supervisor, standing in the corridor with his hands folded behind his back. He was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the soft voice of someone who has never needed to raise it. He asked me if I was lost. I told him I was looking for the washroom. He smiled and told me it was the other direction. Then he asked me to step into his office. I followed him because I had no choice. His office was barely larger than a closet, lined with filing cabinets that reached the ceiling. He closed the door and gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. He did not seem to mind. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, taking his time, and when he finally spoke, his tone was almost apologetic. He said that I had excellent work, truly excellent, and that the Crown valued my contributions. He said that the project I had been assisting with was nearing completion, and that soon my services would no longer be required. He said this as if it were a kindness, as if he were releasing me from a burden. Then he opened a drawer and removed a leather folder. Inside was a blueprint, not a fragment, not a partial schematic, the complete design. Every valve, every chamber, every coil and piston and tube. And at the center, rendered in my own careful hand, was the helmet I had just seen in the testing chamber. Below it, in printed type, was a label. Cognitive Suppression Array, Mark IV, prototype for Crown Security application. I asked him what it meant. He told me it meant progress. He told me that the device allowed for the temporary suspension of independent thought, the redirection of will, the alignment of individual consciousness with a singular purpose. He said it was a tool for maintaining order, for preventing unrest, for protecting the realm from those who would see it fall into chaos. He said it as if these were reasonable things, as if the man I had seen on that table with his eyes empty and his mouth moving in silent screams was a problem that had been solved. I asked him who decided what order looked like, who decided whose will needed redirecting. He closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. He told me that these were not questions for a draftsman. He told me that I had been hired to draw, not to philosophize. He told me that my final payment would be delivered to my lodgings by the end of the week, and that I should consider this conversation a courtesy. Then he opened the door and waited for me to leave. I left. I walked back to my desk, gathered my things, and descended the 3 flights of iron stairs to the main tunnel that led back to the surface. But I did not go home. I climbed back up. I waited until the shift changed, until the corridors emptied and the gas lamps were turned down for the night. Then I returned to Dr. Thorne's office. The lock was simple. My father had taught me more than watchmaking. Inside the drawer was the folder, and inside the folder was the blueprint. I stared at it for a long time, at the device I had helped to create without understanding what I was creating. I thought of the man on the table. I thought of how many more tables there might be, how many more men, how many more helmets descending from ceilings in rooms I would never see. I thought of the word prototype and what it implied about the future. I took the blueprint. I walked to the furnace room at the end of the corridor, the one where they burned the daily refuse and kept the boilers running. The fire was low, but still hot enough. I fed the blueprint into the flames and watched it curl and blacken and disappear. The smoke rose thick and dark, and I stood there until it was nothing but ash. Then I ran. The steam tunnels were a maze, but I had studied the layout during my months below ground. I knew which passages led to the docks, which led to the rail yards, which led to the exits hidden beneath bridges and warehouses. I chose the eastern route, the one that followed the old sewer lines toward Limehouse. The air was thick with moisture, and the walls dripped with condensation that soaked through my skirts and made my boots slip on the stone. I could hear the hiss of steam vents, the clang of distant machinery, the echo of my own breathing. I did not know if anyone had discovered what I had done. I did not know if they were following. I only knew that I had to keep moving. The tunnel opened into a junction where 4 passages met, lit by a single gas lamp that flickered and spat. I stopped to catch my breath, to decide which direction to take. That was when I saw him. He was standing in the center of the junction, perfectly still, as if he had been waiting. He wore a long coat of dark wool, tailored in a way that spoke of money and taste, and his hair was the color of ash in firelight. In his hand, he held a rolled sheet of paper. Even from a distance, even in the dim light, I recognized it. The lines were mine. The measurements were mine. The device was mine. He spoke my name, not Miss Hartley, not the impersonal address Dr. Thorne had used. My given name, soft and certain, as if we were old friends meeting by chance. He said that I had made a mistake. He said that burning 1 copy of a blueprint did not unmake the machine, did not undo the months of labor, did not erase the knowledge that had been drawn and measured and committed to memory. He said that I had been clever, but not clever enough. I asked him who he was. He stepped closer, into the light, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 30, with features that might have been handsome if they had not been so cold. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were pale gray, the color of winter fog, and they looked at me with something that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, something patient and unsettling. He told me his name, the Duke of Ashvale. I had heard the name before, whispered in the corridors, mentioned in passing by Dr. Thorne. The benefactor, the patron of the project, the man whose money had built the laboratory, whose influence had secured the Crown's cooperation, whose vision had demanded the device in the first place. I had imagined him as old, distant, a figure behind closed doors who signed papers and collected reports. I had not imagined him here, in the steam tunnels beneath London, holding the blueprint I had burned. He said that he had been looking for me. He said that he had known I would run, had known I would come this way. He said that I was the only draftsman who had ever truly understood the work, the only one whose hand could translate theory into form with such precision. He said that I was too valuable to lose. I told him I wanted no part of it. I told him I had seen what his machine did, what it would do, and that I would not help him build it. He tilted his head, studying me, and then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. He said that I already had. He said that the prototype was complete, that the tests had been successful, that production would begin within the month. He said that my refusal changed nothing. Then he held out the blueprint. He told me to take it. He told me that if I wanted to destroy his work, I would need to understand it first. He told me that there was more at stake than I realized, more than the crown, more than the device itself. He told me that he had his reasons, and that if I was truly as clever as my drawings suggested, I would want to know what they were. I did not take the blueprint. I turned and ran. I heard him call after me, his voice echoing down the tunnel, but I did not stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, until the sound of steam vents drowned out everything else. I ran until I reached a ladder that led up to a grate beneath a bridge. And I climbed it and pushed the grate aside and pulled myself onto the cold stones of the embankment. The river was black and sluggish, reflecting the lights of the city in broken shards. I sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. He had known I would run. He had known where I would go. He had been waiting for me, as if the entire thing had been choreographed, as if I were a piece in a game I did not know I was playing. And the blueprint. The second copy. He had said there was more at stake, had offered to explain, had looked at me with those fog-gray eyes as if he believed I might actually care. I hated him. I hated his calm certainty, his tailored coat, the way he had spoken my name. I hated that he had made me part of this, that my hands had helped shape the thing I feared most. But more than that, I hated that I wanted to know. I wanted to know why. I wanted to understand what could drive a man to build such a machine, what reasons could possibly justify it. I wanted to believe that there was something I had missed, some context that would make it all make sense. I looked down at my hands. They still smelled of smoke. I did not go home that night. I walked the streets until dawn, staying in the crowds, keeping my head down. I found a boarding house near Covent Garden and paid for a room with the last of my savings. The landlady asked no questions. I locked the door and sat on the narrow bed and tried to think. The Duke of Ashvale knew who I was. He knew where I worked, where I lived, what I was capable of. He had been waiting for me in the tunnels, as if he had drawn a map of my choices and found me at the end of it. Running again would not help. Hiding would not help. He would find me, unless I found him first. I had burned the blueprint, but I had not forgotten it. Every line, every measurement, every detail was still there in my mind, as clear as if I had drawn it that morning. My father used to say that memory was the only tool that could not be taken from you. I had not understood what he meant until now. The Duke thought I was helpless, thought I had destroyed the only evidence of what his machine could do. But I still carried it with me. I still knew how it worked, and if I wanted to stop him, I would need to use that knowledge. I also needed to know who else was involved. The Crown, yes, but who within the Crown? Who had approved the funding, who had signed the orders, who had looked at the cognitive suppression array and decided it was a tool worth building? And what did the Duke mean when he said there was more at stake? What could be more important than the power to control minds, to erase will, to turn men into empty vessels waiting to be filled? I thought of his eyes, the way he had looked at me. Not with cruelty, not with contempt, but with something stranger. Recognition, almost. As if he had been waiting not just for me to run, but for me to understand. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I would not run. I would not hide. I would go back. Not to the laboratory. That part of my life was over. But to him, to the Duke of Ashvale, I would find him, and I would demand the truth. And if he refused, if he tried to use me again, I would find a way to destroy not just the blueprint, but the machine itself. I would find a way to stop him. I did not know then that he was already 3 steps ahead. I did not know that by choosing to confront him, I was doing exactly what he wanted. I did not know that the truth I was chasing would turn out to be far more complicated than I could have imagined. All I knew was that I could still smell the smoke on my hands, and that somewhere in the city, a man with fog-gray eyes was holding a blueprint with my name written in the margins, and I needed to know why. Finding the Duke of Ashvale proved easier than I had expected, which should have been my first warning that I was not hunting him so much as allowing myself to be found. His townhouse stood in Mayfair, a 4-story monument to old money and new ambition. Its facade decorated with brass fixtures that gleamed even in the gray morning light. I arrived just after 8, when the streets were busy enough that a woman alone would not attract attention, but early enough that a duke might still be at breakfast. I had no plan beyond knocking on the door and demanding answers, which was either brave or foolish depending on how generous one chose to be. I suspected it was the latter. The butler who answered was exactly the sort of man one would expect to guard the entrance to a duke's home. Tall, silver-haired, with the expression of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of looking through people rather than at them. I told him I needed to speak with His Grace on a matter of urgent business. He informed me that His Grace did not receive visitors without an appointment, and that I should leave my card if I wished to be considered for a future audience. I told him that His Grace would want to see me, and that, if he did not believe me, he should simply mention the name Hartley and the word blueprint in the same sentence. He left me standing in the entrance hall. It was a space designed to intimidate, all marble and mirrors and a chandelier that must have cost more than my father earned in his entire life. I studied my reflection in one of the mirrors and barely recognized myself. My skirt was still damp from the tunnels, my hair had come loose from its pins, and there were dark circles under my eyes that made me look older than my 24 years. I looked like someone who had not slept, who had made a terrible decision and was about to make another. I looked like someone who should have stayed hidden. The butler returned and told me to follow him. We climbed a staircase lined with portraits of men in military uniforms and women in pearls, all of them staring down with the same cold assessment. He led me to a study on the 2nd floor, knocked once, and opened the door. The Duke of Ashvale was sitting at a desk near the window, reading a newspaper. He did not look up when I entered. He simply folded the paper, set it aside, and gestured to the chair across from him. The butler withdrew and closed the door behind him, leaving us alone. I did not sit. I stood in the center of the room and tried to summon the anger that had carried me here, but it was harder than I expected. In the gaslight of the tunnels, he had seemed dangerous, almost otherworldly. Here, in the soft morning light with his coat removed and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, he looked almost human. Almost. He spoke first. He said that he was glad I had come, that he had hoped I would, that running would have been a waste. He said it as if we were resuming a conversation that had been interrupted rather than beginning one I had forced upon him. I told him I had not come for pleasantries. I told him I wanted to know why. Why the machine? Why me? Why any of it? I told him that if he did not give me a reason, a real reason, I would take what I knew and bring it to the newspapers, to Parliament, to anyone who would listen. He smiled at that. Not the cold smile from the tunnels, but something softer, almost sad. He asked me if I truly believed that would help. He asked me if I thought the Crown would allow such a story to be printed, if I thought Parliament would investigate something they themselves had sanctioned, If I thought anyone with the power to stop the machine would care what a former draftsman had to say. He said that I was clever, but that I did not yet understand how power worked. I told him I understood enough. I understood that he had built a device to steal people's thoughts, to turn them into puppets, to make them obey without question. I understood that he had used crown funding to do it, that he had hidden the project beneath the city where no one would see, and that he had hired people like me to help him do it without telling us what we were creating. I told him I understood that he was a monster. He stood then, slowly, and walked to the window. He looked out at the street below, at the carriages passing and the pedestrians hurrying to their destinations. He was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had expected. He asked me if I had ever wondered why the Crown wanted such a device, what they planned to use it for, who they planned to use it on. I told him I did not care about the Crown's plans. I cared about what he had made possible. He turned to look at me then, and there was something in his expression I had not seen before. Not anger, not amusement, something closer to exhaustion. He said that I should care because the Crown's plans were far worse than anything I had imagined, and that the machine I had seen was not the one they had asked him to build. I did not understand. He walked back to his desk and removed a key from his waistcoat pocket. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a folder, thicker than the one Dr. Thorne had shown me, filled with papers covered in dense type and official seals. He told me to read it. I hesitated, then took the folder and sat down. The first document was a proposal submitted to the Home Office 2 years earlier. It outlined a plan for what it called social stabilization, a method for reducing unrest in the industrial districts where strikes and riots had become common. The method involved the mass deployment of a device capable of inducing compliance in large populations. Not temporary compliance, not individual targeting, but permanent alteration of the subject's ability to question authority. The proposal estimated that a single installation could affect up to 5,000 people within a 3-mile radius. It recommended beginning with the coal towns in the north, where labor movements were strongest. The second document was a contract. It named the Duke of Ashvale as the primary contractor, granted him full immunity from legal consequence, and provided funding in the amount of £200,000. It was signed by 3 members of the cabinet and countersigned by someone whose name I did not recognize, but whose title was listed as Director of Crown Security. The third document was a series of test reports. They described experiments conducted on prisoners, on workhouse residents, on men and women who had been given no choice and no warning. The reports were clinical, detached, written in the language of science rather than humanity. Subject exhibited full compliance within 12 minutes of exposure. Subject retained motor function, but demonstrated no independent initiative. Subject responded to direct commands, but did not speak unless prompted. The tests had been conducted over a period of 6 months. None of the subjects had recovered. I set the folder down. My hands were shaking. I asked him why he was showing me this. He said because I needed to understand that he had not invented the idea, had not proposed the plan, had not wanted any of it. The Crown had come to him because of his reputation, because he had built machines for them before, machines that extracted coal more efficiently, and locomotives that ran faster, and pumps that moved water through the new sewer systems. They had come to him because he was good at solving problems, and they had presented this as just another problem to solve. He had refused. They had threatened him. They had told him that if he did not build the machine, they would find someone else who would, someone with fewer scruples and less skill, and that the result would be far more dangerous than anything he could create. So he had agreed. But not to build what they wanted. He had built something else. A prototype that looked like the device they had requested, but functioned differently. The cognitive suppression array I had seen in the testing chamber did not induce permanent compliance. It induced temporary disorientation, confusion, a suspension of will that lasted only as long as the device was active. It was frightening, yes, but it was not irreversible. It was not the weapon the Crown wanted, it was a deception. I asked him why. Why go through the trouble of building a false machine, of hiring draftsmen and conducting tests and maintaining the pretense? Why not simply refuse? Consequences be damned. He said that refusal was not an option, not for men like him. The Crown did not ask, they demanded. And if they believed he was building what they wanted, they would leave him alone long enough for him to find another way. A way to expose what they were planning, to reveal the truth before the real machine could be completed. A way to stop them. He said that was where I came in. He had known from the beginning that someone would realize what the blueprint suggested, that someone would see past the fragments and understand the whole. He had been waiting for that person, hoping for them. When I burned the blueprint, when I ran, he knew I was the one. He said that I was not just a draftsman, I was the only person who could help him finish what he had started. I did not believe him. I told him that it was a convenient story, that he could say anything and I would have no way to verify it. I told him that for all I knew, the documents in the folder were forgeries, that the entire thing was a manipulation designed to make me complicit in something even worse. I told him that I had learned not to trust men who spoke of noble intentions while building machines of control. He did not argue. He simply nodded, as if he had expected my skepticism, as if it were reasonable and even admirable. He said that I was right not to trust him, that trust had to be earned, and that he had not yet earned mine. But he also said that time was running out. The Crown was growing impatient. Dr. Thorne had reported my disappearance, and questions were being asked. Within a week, maybe less, they would realize that the prototype was not what they had paid for, and when that happened, they would find someone else, someone who would build the real machine. He asked me what I wanted to do. Did I want to run, to disappear into the city and hope they never found me? Did I want to go to the authorities, to try to convince people who already knew the truth and did not care? Or did I want to fight? Did I want to help him destroy the project from within, to sabotage it in a way that could not be undone, to make sure that no version of the machine, real or false, ever saw mass production? I stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that somewhere beneath them men were building devices to strip them of their will. I thought about my father, who had taught me that precision was a kind of prayer. I thought about the man on the table with his empty eyes. I thought about the blueprints I had drawn, the lines I had made so carefully, the contribution I had made without understanding what I was contributing to. I asked him what he needed from me. He said he needed the machine to fail, not just to malfunction, but to fail in a way that could not be repaired, could not be replicated. He needed someone who understood every detail of its construction, to sabotage it so thoroughly that the Crown would have no choice but to abandon the project entirely. He said that he could provide access, could create opportunities, but that he could not do it alone. He needed someone with my knowledge, my skill, my willingness to take the risk. I asked him what would happen to me if I agreed, if we failed, if we were caught. He did not lie. He said that I would be arrested, tried in secret, and very likely executed. He said that treason was not forgiven, especially not when it interfered with matters of national security. He said that he could offer me no protection, no guarantee of safety. All he could offer was the chance to do something that mattered. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw something I had not expected. Not calculation, not manipulation, but something raw and honest. Fear, maybe, or desperation. The look of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for too long and was hoping, against all reason, that someone else might help him bear it. I told him I would think about it. He said that was all he could ask. Then he walked me to the door himself, without calling for the butler, and as I stepped into the corridor, he said my name again. Just my given name, soft and uncertain, as if he were testing how it sounded. He said that he understood if I chose to walk away, that he would not blame me, that I had already done more than most people would have. He said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I left without answering. I walked down the stairs and out into the cold morning air, and I did not look back. But I knew, even then, that I would return. Not because I trusted him, not because I believed his story, but because he was right about one thing. I had already drawn the lines. I had already made the machine possible. And if I did nothing, if I let someone else build the real version, then every mind it stole would be my responsibility as much as theirs. I spent the rest of the day walking through the city, trying to convince myself that I had a choice. I passed factories where men worked 16-hour shifts for wages that barely kept them fed. I passed workhouses where children stood in lines waiting for bread. I passed police constables on corners, watching the crowds with suspicion, ready to arrest anyone who looked too angry or too desperate or too willing to ask why things were the way they were. I thought about what the machine could do to those people, what it would do if the crown had its way. How many minds would be emptied? How many wills would be erased? How many people would be turned into obedient shadows of themselves? By evening, I had made my decision. I returned to the boarding house, packed what little I had, and wrote a letter to the landlady saying I would not be returning. Then I went back to Mayfair. The Duke answered the door himself this time. He looked surprised, as if he had not truly expected me to come back. I told him I would help him. I told him that I wanted to see the machine destroyed, the project ended, and the crown's plans exposed. I told him that if he was lying, if this was a trap, I would find a way to make him regret it. He smiled at that, a real smile, and for the first time I saw warmth in those fog-gray eyes. He invited me inside. He said we had much to plan, much to prepare, and very little time. He said that the crown was already suspicious, that Dr. Thorne was being pressured for answers, and that we would need to move quickly if we wanted to stay ahead of them. He said that it would be dangerous, that we would both be risking everything, but that if we succeeded, we might actually change something. I followed him up to the study. He spread maps and diagrams across the desk, showed me blueprints of the laboratory, schedules of the guard rotations, inventories of the materials stored in the lower levels. He spoke quickly, precisely, like a general planning a campaign. And as I listened, as I began to see the shape of his plan, I realized something that both frightened and thrilled me. He was not just trying to stop the machine. He was trying to bring down the entire operation, to expose everyone involved, to make sure that the crown could never attempt anything like this again. It was ambitious. It was reckless. It was probably impossible. But as I stood there in his study, surrounded by papers and plans and the faint smell of tobacco and ink, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Hope, perhaps, or purpose. The sense that I was no longer just a draftsman drawing lines I did not understand, but someone who could shape the outcome, who could fight back. The Duke looked at me then, and his expression was unreadable. He said that he was glad I had come back. He said that he had not wanted to do this alone. And then, so quietly I almost did not hear it, he said that he had hoped it would be me. I did not know what to say to that. I did not know what it meant, or why it made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I only knew that somewhere in the course of the evening, in the space between his confession and my decision, something had shifted between us, something fragile and complicated and impossible to name. We worked until dawn, and when the first light came through the window, when we finally stopped to rest, I looked at him and realized that I was no longer sure who I was fighting for. The people who would be saved by stopping the machine, yes, but also, perhaps, the man who had asked me to help him, the man who had built a false machine to buy time, the man with fog-gray eyes who had been waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to say yes. I did not know then that saying yes would cost me more than I could have imagined. I did not know that the Crown already suspected him, that Dr. Thorne had already sent a report, that soldiers were being dispatched even as we planned our sabotage. I did not know that within 3 days everything would fall apart, and that I would be forced to make a choice I never wanted to make. All I knew was that the Duke of Ashval was no longer just the man who had built the machine. He was the man I was choosing to trust, and that, more than anything, terrified me. We returned to the tunnels on the third night, and I understood then that some places remember violence even before it happens. The Duke had secured false credentials for both of us, documents that identified us as inspectors from the Office of Industrial Safety, conducting a routine evaluation of the ventilation systems. It was a thin cover, but it was enough to get us past the first checkpoint. The guards barely looked at our papers. They were more interested in their card game, in the flask they passed between them, in anything except the tedious work of monitoring a door that no one ever tried to breach. We descended the iron stairs in silence, our footsteps echoing in the narrow shaft. And with each step, I felt the weight of what we were about to do settle more heavily on my shoulders. The laboratory was different at night. During the day, it had been full of noise, the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam and the constant murmur of men talking over their work. Now it was quiet, almost empty, lit only by the dim glow of gas lamps turned down to conserve fuel. The skeleton crew that remained were engineers tasked with monitoring the boilers and maintaining the pressure in the main pipes. They paid us no attention. We were just two more officials making notes on clipboards, two more intruders in a space that had seen so many it no longer cared. The Duke led me through corridors I had walked 100 times, but they felt unfamiliar now, as if I were seeing them through someone else's eyes. He moved with purpose, without hesitation, and I followed him because I had no choice. We passed the drafting room where I had spent 18 months copying fragments of machines I did not understand. The desks were empty, the lamps extinguished, and my old workspace looked abandoned, as if I had never been there at all. I thought of the woman who had sat at that desk every morning, who had told herself that asking questions was not her place, who had believed that precision was enough. I barely recognized her. We reached the testing chamber. The iron door was closed, but not locked. The Duke produced a key, turned it slowly, and pushed the door open. The hinges did not creak. Inside, the room was exactly as I remembered it. The table, with its leather straps, the brass chains hanging from the ceiling, the helmet with its glass chambers and rubber tubes, still suspended above the empty table like a mechanical spider waiting for prey. The green liquid in the chambers had dimmed to a faint glow, pulsing slowly, as if the device itself were breathing. The Duke closed the door behind us and locked it from the inside. He set his satchel on the floor and began removing tools. Wrenches, pliers, a small hand drill, vials of clear liquid that I recognized as solvents used for cleaning copper fittings. He worked quickly, methodically, and I watched him for a moment before I understood what he was doing. He was not just sabotaging the machine. He was dismantling it in a way that would make it impossible to repair, removing components that could not be replaced, dissolving seals that held the pressure chambers intact. It was careful work, precise work, the kind of work that required someone who understood not just how the machine functioned, but how to make it fail without leaving evidence of sabotage. He told me to check the control panel near the door. He said that if the pressure in the main system dropped too quickly, it would trigger an alarm that would bring the guards. I needed to monitor the gauges and warn him if the needle started to move into the red. I crossed to the panel and studied the dials. The pressure was steady, holding at 80 pounds per square inch. I placed my hand on the cool brass of the largest gauge and felt the faint vibration of steam moving through pipes beneath the floor. It reminded me of my father's workshop, of the watches he used to repair, their tiny mechanisms ticking in perfect synchronization. I wondered what he would think of me now, standing in a room full of stolen time, trying to break something instead of fix it. The Duke spoke without looking up from his work. He asked me if I was frightened. I told him yes. He said that was good, that fear meant I understood the stakes, that only fools approached danger without it. Then he paused and glanced at me, and there was something in his expression that I had not seen before. Not the cold calculation of our first meeting, not the exhaustion of his confession, but something gentler. He said that he was frightened too. He said that he had been frightened since the moment the crown approached him, since the moment he realized what they wanted him to build. He said that fear was what had kept him careful, what had kept him alive. I asked him if he regretted it. Taking the contract, building the false machine, all of it. He set down his wrench and looked at me fully. He said that he regretted many things, but not that. He said that if he had refused, if he had let someone else build the machine, he would have spent the rest of his life wondering if he could have stopped it. He said that regret was easier to live with than complicity. I understood what he meant. I had spent 18 months complicit in something I did not understand, and the weight of it had only grown heavier with knowledge. But standing here, doing something, even if it was dangerous and possibly futile, felt like the first honest thing I had done in a long time. It felt like choosing. The Duke returned to his work. He removed a section of tubing, drained the liquid from one of the chambers into a flask, and used the solvent to dissolve the rubber seals that connected the helmet to the central reservoir. The smell was sharp and chemical, and it made my eyes water. I turned back to the gauges. The needle had not moved. Everything was holding steady. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. I froze. The Duke heard them too. He straightened, listening, and we both held our breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, the sound of someone making rounds rather than responding to an alarm. They paused outside the door. I could see the shadow beneath it, the shape of boots blocking the light from the corridor. My hand tightened on the edge of the control panel. The Duke slipped his hand into his coat pocket, and I knew without seeing that he had brought a weapon. I had not asked him what we would do if we were discovered. I had not wanted to know. The footsteps moved on. The shadow disappeared. We waited another minute, maybe two, before we allowed ourselves to breathe again. The Duke exhaled slowly and returned to his work, but his hands were not quite as steady as they had been before. He said that we needed to hurry. He said that the guards would make another round in 20 minutes, and we needed to be gone before then. I asked him if the machine was disabled. He said almost. He needed to remove one more component, a valve that regulated the flow of pressure into the helmet. Without it, the device would be inert. A collection of parts that looked impressive, but could do nothing. He reached up into the mechanism, his fingers working blind, and I heard the faint click of metal on metal. Then he pulled the valve free and held it up to the light. It was small, no larger than my thumb, made of brass and etched with fine grooves that allowed steam to pass through in controlled bursts. He slipped it into his pocket and began reassembling the outer casing so that the machine would appear intact at a casual glance. That was when the alarm sounded. It was not the pressure alarm I had been watching. It was something else, a sharp ringing bell that echoed through the tunnels like a warning from hell. The Duke swore under his breath. He grabbed his satchel, shoved the tools inside, and told me to move. I did not ask what had triggered it. I did not need to. We had been discovered, or someone had noticed something wrong, or the Crown had finally decided to close the trap they had been setting since the moment I burned the blueprint. It did not matter. What mattered was getting out. We ran. The corridor was no longer empty. Doors were opening. Engineers emerging to see what the alarm meant. Guards appearing from side passages with rifles in hand. The Duke grabbed my arm and pulled me into a side tunnel, one of the maintenance shafts that ran parallel to the main corridors. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the walls were slick with condensation. We moved as quickly as we could, but the alarm kept ringing, and I could hear voices shouting behind us, the sound of boots on stone growing louder. The tunnel opened into a junction where 3 pipes converged, each one as wide as a carriage and hot enough that I could feel the heat radiating from the metal. The Duke stopped, looking around, trying to orient himself. I asked him if he knew the way out. He said yes, but that we would need to cross the main pipe gallery to reach it. I did not understand what he meant until he led me to a catwalk that stretched across the gallery, suspended 50 feet above a floor lined with massive steam pipes that hissed and rumbled like sleeping dragons. The catwalk was narrow, made of iron grating, and it swayed slightly as we stepped onto it. Below us, the air shimmered with heat. We were halfway across when I heard the voice. It was Dr. Thorne calling from somewhere behind us, telling the guards to cut off the exits. He said that the intruders were armed and dangerous, that they were saboteurs working for enemies of the crown, that they were to be stopped by any means necessary. The Duke did not slow down. He kept moving, his hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt, pulling me forward even as the catwalk shook beneath our feet. We reached the other side and plunged into another tunnel, this one darker and colder, the walls coated with rust and moss. The sound of the alarm was fainter here, but I could still hear the guards behind us, their voices echoing in the confined space. The Duke stopped at a junction and pulled a small device from his pocket. It looked like a compass, but instead of a needle, it had a dial that glowed faintly green. He studied it, turned left, and kept running. I asked him what the device was. He said it was a resonance tracker, something he had built to detect variations in steam pressure. He said that the tunnels were a maze, but the pressure variations created a map if you knew how to read them. He said it would lead us to an exit, one that was not being watched. I did not ask how he knew. I trusted him. I had no choice but to trust him. The tunnel began to slope upward. The air grew colder, fresher, and I could smell rain. We passed through a chamber filled with abandoned machinery, great iron wheels and gears that had not turned in years, their surfaces covered in dust and cobwebs. The Duke led me to a ladder bolted to the far wall. He climbed first, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it, and I followed. The ladder was long, at least 30 feet, and by the time I reached the top, my arms were shaking. The Duke pushed open a hatch and pulled himself through, then reached down to help me up. We emerged in an alley behind a warehouse near the river. It was raining, a cold drizzle that soaked through my coat in seconds, and the sky was the color of wet slate. The Duke closed the hatch and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. I did the same. For a long moment we just stood there, listening to the rain and the distant sound of the city waking up. Then he started to laugh. It was not a happy sound, more a release of tension, the kind of laughter that comes when you realize you are still alive and cannot quite believe it. I asked him if the machine was truly disabled. He pulled the valve from his pocket and held it up. He said that without this, the cognitive suppression array was nothing but an expensive sculpture. He said that it would take them weeks to realize what was missing, and even longer to fabricate a replacement. He said that we had bought time, maybe enough to expose the project before they could rebuild. Then he looked at me, and his expression turned serious. He said that we needed to disappear, that Dr. Thorne would have reported our descriptions, that the Crown would be looking for us. He said that he had a place we could go, somewhere they would not think to search, but that we needed to leave London immediately. I asked him where. He said the estate his family owned in the countryside, a place he had not visited in years, isolated and forgotten. He said it was a risk, but less of a risk than staying in the city. He said that if I trusted him, if I was willing to keep going, we could finish what we had started. We could gather evidence, find allies, make sure the truth came out. But it would mean leaving everything behind. It would mean becoming fugitives. I looked at him standing there in the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, his coat torn at the sleeve, the valve still clutched in his hand like a talisman. I thought about what he had risked for this, what he had given up. I thought about the machine I had helped build, the people it would have hurt, the mines it would have stolen. I thought about my father, who had taught me that precision was a prayer, and I wondered if this was what he meant, that sometimes the most careful thing you could do was choose to break something that should never have been built. I told him yes. I told him I would go with him. He smiled then, a real smile, tired and grateful, and something more. He said that we should move quickly, that the rain would cover our tracks, but only for so long. He led me through the alleys, staying away from the main streets, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the city well. We passed through neighborhoods I had never seen, places where the buildings leaned against each other like old men too weary to stand alone. We crossed the river on a footbridge where the water ran black and thick with coal dust. We kept moving until we reached a stable on the outskirts of the city, where the Duke paid a man to hitch a carriage and ask no questions. We climbed inside and pulled the curtains closed. The carriage lurched forward, and I felt the city begin to fall away behind us. The Duke sat across from me, silent, watching me with those fog-gray eyes. I asked him if he thought we would succeed. He said he did not know. He said that the crown was powerful, that they had resources we could not match, that even if we exposed the project, they might find a way to continue it in secret. But he also said that doing nothing was not an option, that we had to try, that sometimes trying was enough. I asked him why it mattered to him so much, why risk everything, why fight a battle he could have walked away from. He was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. He said that his younger brother had been a labor organizer, that he had spoken out against the conditions in the factories, that he had led strikes and written pamphlets and believed that people deserved better. He said that one day his brother had been arrested on charges of sedition. He said that when he visited him in prison, his brother did not recognize him. He said that his brother's eyes had been empty, his voice flat, his will gone. He said that he never found out what they did to him, but he knew it was a test, a prototype for something larger. He said that his brother died 6 months later. He said that no one called it murder, that officially it was illness, but he knew better. He said that when the Crown approached him with the contract, when they asked him to build a device that could do to thousands what had been done to his brother, he knew he could not refuse, but he also knew he could not build it, so he built a lie instead, a machine that looked like what they wanted but could never do what they feared. He said that every day he worked on it, he thought of his brother. He said that stopping the machine was not just about the people it would hurt. It was about the one person it had already destroyed. I did not know what to say. I reached across the space between us and took his hand. He looked down at our joined hands as if surprised, as if he had forgotten what comfort felt like. Then he squeezed my fingers gently and did not let go. We rode in silence after that, the rain drumming on the roof of the carriage, the wheels turning beneath us, carrying us away from the city and into the unknown. I did not know what waited for us at the estate. I did not know if we would be safe there, or if the Crown would find us, or if our plan would succeed. I only knew that I was no longer alone, that the man sitting across from me, holding my hand in the darkness, was no longer just the Duke of Ashvale or the inventor of a false machine. He was someone who had lost what I feared losing, someone who understood what it meant to fight for something, even when the fight seemed hopeless. And somewhere in the space between the city and the countryside, between the life I had left behind and the uncertain future ahead, I realized that I was no longer fighting just to stop the machine. I was fighting for him, for the man who had asked me to help him, who had trusted me with the truth, who had looked at me as if I mattered. And that realization, more than anything, terrified me, because it meant that if we failed, if we were caught, I would lose more than my life. I would lose the only person who had ever made me feel like I was more than just a draftsman drawing lines she did not understand. The carriage rolled on through the rain, and I held his hand tighter, and I tried not to think about what morning would bring. The estate appeared through the morning fog like something out of a ghost story, all gray stone and ivy-covered walls and windows that reflected nothing but clouds. We had traveled through the night, stopping only once to change horses at a coaching inn where the Duke paid extra for discretion and hurried conversation. By the time we passed through the iron gates that marked the boundary of his family's land, I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. The carriage rolled up a long drive lined with oak trees whose branches formed a tunnel overhead, blocking out what little light the dawn provided. When we finally stopped in front of the main house, the Duke helped me down, and I nearly stumbled. He caught me, his hands steady on my arms, and told me to rest. He said we were safe here, at least for now. The house was larger than I had expected. 3 stories of weathered stone with a tower on the western corner, and gardens that had long since gone wild. It had the look of a place that had once been grand but had been left to decay. The kind of estate that aristocratic families kept because they could not afford to maintain it but could not bear to sell it. The Duke led me inside through a servant's entrance, explaining that the main doors had not been opened in years. The interior was cold and dark, the furniture covered in sheets, the air thick with dust. He lit a lamp and guided me up a narrow staircase to a room on the 2nd floor. He said it had been his sister's room once, before she married and moved to Scotland. He said I could stay here as long as I needed. I thanked him and sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was lumpy and smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. The Duke lingered in the doorway, as if uncertain whether to leave or stay. I asked him if he was all right. He said that he had not been to this place since his brother died, that he had avoided it because it held too many memories. He said that every room reminded him of arguments with his father, of his mother's disappointment, of the weight of expectations he could never quite meet. He said that coming back felt like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. I told him I understood. I told him that I had avoided my father's workshop for months after he died, that I could not bear to see his tools still arranged on the bench, still waiting for hands that would never return. I told him that grief had a way of making places unbearable, but that sometimes returning to them was the only way to move forward. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded. He said he would let me rest, that we would talk in the morning about what came next. Then he closed the door softly and left me alone. I lay down without removing my boots and fell asleep immediately. When I woke, it was late afternoon, and the room was filled with pale golden light. I could hear rain on the windows, a soft, steady sound that made the world feel distant and unreal. I rose and washed my face in the basin on the dresser, then went downstairs to find the Duke. He was in the library, a cavernous room lined with books that no one had read in decades. He had started a fire in the hearth and was sitting at a desk covered in papers, writing by the light of an oil lamp. He looked up when I entered and gestured to a chair near the fire. He said he had been drafting letters, correspondence to men he trusted who might be willing to help us, journalists, members of parliament who had spoken out against crown overreach, scientists who valued ethics over advancement. He said that if we could gather enough support, if we could present the evidence in a way that could not be ignored, we might have a chance of stopping the project permanently. I asked him if he truly believed that. He set down his pen and looked at me with those fog-gray eyes that seemed to see more than I wanted them to. He said that he had to believe it, because the alternative was unbearable. He said that hope was a fragile thing, but that it was all we had. We spent the next 3 days at the estate, working together to compile evidence and plan our next move. The Duke had brought documents from his study in London, the contracts and test reports that proved the Crown's involvement. I wrote out detailed descriptions of the machine, technical specifications that demonstrated its purpose and potential. We catalogued everything, organized it into a case that could be presented to the right people. It was meticulous work, the kind of work that required focus and patience, and it reminded me of my time in the drafting room. But this time I understood what I was creating. This time the lines I drew were my own. In the evenings we talked, not about the machine or the crown or the danger we were in, but about other things. He told me about his childhood, about growing up in a house where love was conditional and approval had to be earned through achievement. He told me about his brother, not just the tragedy of his death, but the joy of his life, the way he had laughed and argued and believed that the world could be better. He told me about the machines he had built before the Crown approached him, inventions designed to make work easier and live safer, things he had been proud of before pride became complicated. I told him about my father, about the workshop where I had learned to see the world as a series of interconnected parts. I told him about the years after my father died, when I had taken work wherever I could find it. When I had learned that being a woman in a man's profession meant being invisible or being dismissed. I told him about the loneliness of precision, the way it felt to be good at something that no one valued. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said that he valued it. He said that my skill was not just technical, but moral, that I had seen what was wrong and chosen to act. He said that was rarer than I knew. On the fourth night, I found him standing in the tower, looking out at the rain. The tower room was small and circular, with windows on all sides and a telescope pointed at the sky. He said that his brother used to come here to watch the stars, that he had believed the universe was vast enough to contain hope for everyone. He said that he wished his brother could have lived to see what we were trying to do, that he would have been proud. I stood beside him at the window. The rain had turned the landscape into a study in gray, the fields and trees blurring together until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. I asked him if he was frightened of what would happen when we returned to London. He said yes. He said that fear was constant now, a weight he carried every moment, but that it was easier to bear when he was not alone. Then he turned to look at me, and his expression was unguarded in a way I had never seen. He said that he was grateful I had stayed, that I had not run when I had the chance. He said that he did not know what he would have done without me. I told him the truth. I told him that I had almost run, that part of me still wanted to, that the sensible thing would have been to disappear and let someone else fight this battle. But I also told him that I could not do that, not anymore. I told him that what we were doing mattered, and that he mattered, and that I wanted to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. He reached out and touched my face, his fingers light against my cheek, and I did not pull away. He said my name, just my name, and there was something in his voice that made my heart ache. Then he leaned forward and kissed me. It was gentle, hesitant, as if he were asking a question he was not sure I would answer. I kissed him back, and the question dissolved into certainty. His arms came around me, and I pressed closer, feeling the warmth of him through the layers of wool and linen, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine. The rain kept falling, and the world kept turning, and for that one moment, nothing else mattered. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine and exhaled slowly. He said that he had not meant for this to happen, that he had not wanted to complicate things, but that he could not pretend anymore. He said that somewhere between the tunnels and the estate, somewhere in the space between fear and hope, he had stopped seeing me as just an ally. He said he cared for me, deeply, in a way that frightened him because it made everything more fragile. He said that if anything happened to me because of this, because of him, he would never forgive himself. I told him that I was not fragile. I told him that I had made my own choices, that I was here because I wanted to be, and that whatever happened next was not his burden alone to carry. I told him that I cared for him too, more than I had allowed myself to admit, and that I was tired of pretending I did not. I told him that the world was full of reasons to be afraid, but that being afraid together was better than being brave alone. He smiled at that, a soft, sad smile, and pulled me close again. We stood there in the tower as the rain fell and the darkness gathered, and I let myself believe, just for a moment, that we might actually survive this, that we might stop the machine and expose the crown and find a way to build something good from the wreckage, that we might have a future beyond fugitive nights and borrowed time. But hope, I was learning, was always sharpest just before it shattered. The soldiers came the next morning. I was in the library organizing the last of the documents when I heard the sound of hooves on the gravel drive. I went to the window and saw them, a dozen men in crown uniforms with rifles slung across their backs. They dismounted in formation and began surrounding the house, cutting off every exit. At the front of the group was a man in a dark coat. older than the others, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. I did not need to see his face to know who he was, the director of Crown Security, the man whose signature was on the contract that had started all of this. The Duke appeared beside me. He had seen them too. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. He said that we needed to leave immediately, that there was a passageway beneath the house that led to the old stables. He said that if we moved quickly, we might reach it before they breached the doors. He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the corridor. But we had barely reached the stairs when we heard the crash of the front door being forced open. Footsteps echoed through the entrance hall, voices shouting commands, the metallic click of rifles being readied. We ran. We made it to the kitchens, and the Duke pulled open a hidden door in the pantry floor, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness. He told me to go first. I climbed down quickly, my hands slipping on the rungs, and he followed, pulling the door closed above us. The passage was narrow and damp, barely tall enough to stand in, and it stretched away into blackness. The Duke lit a match and held it up, revealing stone walls slick with moss and a floor covered in water. He said we needed to move quickly, that it was 1/2 mile to the stables, and that they would search the house first before they thought to look for hidden passages. We moved as fast as we could, splashing through the shallow water, the match casting wild shadows on the walls. I could hear sounds above us, muffled by stone and earth, the crash of furniture being overturned, the shouts of soldiers searching rooms. The Duke kept glancing back, as if expecting to see light behind us, as if expecting the soldiers to discover the passage at any moment. The match burned down to his fingers, and he lit another, then another. We were running out of light and running out of time. The passage ended at another ladder. The Duke climbed first and pushed at the hatch above. It did not move. He pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. And finally it gave way with a groan of rusted metal. He pulled himself up and reached down to help me. I grabbed his hand, and he hauled me up into the stables. The building was old and half collapsed, the stalls empty, and the roof open to the sky. Rain poured through the holes, turning the floor into mud. There were no horses, no carriages, nothing we could use to escape. The Duke swore under his breath. He said that the horses must have been moved years ago, that he had not thought to check, that he had been a fool to hope. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, and for the first time I saw defeat in his expression. I told him we could still run. We could go on foot, head for the woods, find a way to circle back to the main road. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I saw something in his gaze that made my chest tighten. He said that they would catch us. He said that the woods were surrounded, that the soldiers had orders to shoot on sight, that running would only delay the inevitable. He said that there was only one way to end this, and that it was not the way either of us wanted. I asked him what he meant. He reached into his coat and pulled out the valve he had taken from the machine. He held it up, turning it over in his palm. He said that this was the proof, the only physical evidence that the device had been sabotaged. He said that if the Crown captured us, they would take it, would rebuild the machine, would continue the project as if we had never interfered. But if one of us escaped, if one of us survived to deliver the evidence we had compiled, then the fight would not be over. Someone would still be able to expose the truth. I understood what he was saying. I told him no. I told him we would face this together, that I was not leaving him behind. He took my hands and squeezed them tightly. He said that he had spent his entire life running from things, from his family's expectations and his brother's death and the weight of his own choices. He said that he was tired of running. He said that if he could do one thing right, one thing that mattered, it would be making sure I survived. He said that I was the only person who understood the machine well enough to explain it, the only person who could make the case that needed to be made. He said that I had to go. I told him I would not. I told him that he was not just sacrificing himself, he was asking me to live with the guilt of leaving him, and that I could not do that. He leaned forward and kissed me, hard and desperate, and when he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. He said that guilt was better than death, that I deserved a future even if he did not, and that if I truly cared for him, I would honor what he was asking. He said that love was not about staying together. Sometimes it was about letting go. He pressed the valve into my hand and closed my fingers around it. Then he pushed me toward the rear door of the stables, the one that opened onto the woods. He said that the soldiers would search here eventually, but that if I ran now, if I stayed low and moved fast, I might make it to the road before they realized I was gone. He said that there was a coaching inn 10 miles south, that I should go there and hire a carriage and get as far from here as possible. He said that the documents we had compiled were still in the library, hidden in a false bottom of the desk drawer. He said that if I could reach them, if I could get them to the right people, then none of this would have been for nothing. I told him I loved him. The words came out raw and broken, and I had not meant to say them, had not even known I felt them until they were there between us. He closed his eyes as if the words hurt, and then he smiled. He said that he loved me too, had loved me since the moment I came back to his house instead of running away, had loved me for my courage and my precision, and the way I had chosen to fight even when fighting seemed impossible. He said that loving me was the best thing he had ever done, and that he would carry it with him wherever he went next. Then he opened the door and pushed me through it. I stumbled into the rain and turned back, but he was already closing the door, already moving toward the front of the stables where the soldiers' voices were growing louder. I wanted to go back. I wanted to break down the door and drag him with me. But I knew that if I did, we would both be captured. We would both die, and everything we had fought for would be lost. So I ran. I ran into the woods with the valve clutched in my hand and the rain soaking through my clothes and the sound of his voice echoing in my head. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree, sobbing. I ran because he had asked me to, because he had loved me enough to let me go, because I owed it to him to survive. Behind me, I heard gunshots. 3 of them, sharp and final, cutting through the rain like the closing of a door. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. I did not know if they had captured him or killed him. I did not know if he had fought or surrendered. I only knew that he was gone and that I was alone again. I stayed there until the voices faded, until the soldiers left and the woods grew quiet. Then I stood up and started walking. I walked through the rain and the mud and the darkness, following the direction he had given me, moving toward the road and the inn and the uncertain future beyond. I walked because it was the only thing I could still do. I walked because he had asked me to, and as I walked, I made a promise. I promised that I would finish what we had started. I would expose the Crown's project, would make sure the world knew what they had tried to build, would make certain that his sacrifice meant something. I promised that I would not let his death be in vain. But more than that, I promised that I would remember him. Not just as the Duke of Ashvale or the inventor of a false machine, but as the man who had loved me enough to let me live. The man who had chosen me over himself. The man whose fog-gray eyes had seen something in me worth saving. I clutched the valve tighter and kept walking. The rain kept falling. And somewhere behind me, in the ruins of an estate no one would remember, a man who had tried to be better than his choices lay still. I reached London 3 days later, hollow and haunted, and carrying a valve that weighed more than brass had any right to. The coaching inn had been exactly where he said it would be, and the innkeeper had asked no questions when I paid for a room with coins I found sewn into the lining of my coat. The Duke had thought of everything, had prepared for the possibility that I would need to run alone. I had lain awake in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain, and feeling the absence of him like a physical wound. By morning I knew what I had to do. I could not bring him back. I could not undo the choice he had made. But I could make it matter. I returned to the city not as a fugitive, but as a ghost, someone who moved through crowds without being seen, who kept her head down and her face hidden. I found lodging in Whitechapel, in a boarding house where the landlady cared more about payment than names. I retrieved the documents from a contact the Duke had mentioned, a clerk who owed him a favor and who had managed to collect the evidence from the estate before the Crown could seize it. The papers were water-stained and some of the ink had run, but they were still readable, still damning. I spent a week preparing my case. I rewrote the technical specifications in language that could be understood by people who had never seen a blueprint. I compiled the test reports, the contracts, the correspondence between the Crown and the Duke. I wrote a detailed account of what I had witnessed in the testing chamber, what the machine was designed to do, and what would happen if it were ever deployed. I wrote about the Duke's brother, about the test that had destroyed him, about the motivation behind a project that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with control. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes burned, and I could no longer tell if I was documenting the truth or eulogizing the man I had lost. The question was who to trust with it. The newspapers would not print it without verification, and verification would require sources within the government who were willing to risk their careers. Members of Parliament were compromised or complicit or too frightened to act. The police served the Crown. The courts would never allow the case to be heard. I needed someone with influence, someone with a reputation for integrity, someone who could not be silenced or bought. I found him in the most unexpected place, a lecture hall near the British Museum, where a scientist named Professor Edmund Graves was speaking about the ethics of technological progress. I had heard the Duke mention his name once, had heard him say that Graves was one of the few men in England who valued truth over advancement. I went to the lecture and sat in the back row, listening as the professor argued that science without conscience was not progress, but barbarism, that machines built to control rather than liberate were perversions of human ingenuity. When the lecture ended, I waited until the crowd dispersed, then approached him. I told him I had evidence of a government project that contradicted everything he had just spoken about. I told him it involved a device designed to suppress human will, that it had been tested on prisoners and workhouse residents, that the Crown intended to deploy it in industrial districts to prevent unrest. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and then he asked me to show him the evidence. We met the next day in his office, a cluttered room filled with books and diagrams and half-assembled machines that looked like they belonged in a different century. I spread the documents across his desk and watched as he read through them, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he sat back and removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. He asked me if I understood what I was asking him to do. I told him yes. I told him that exposing this would make him a target, that the Crown would come after him, that he would be risking everything. He said that he had spent his entire career arguing that science should serve humanity, and that if he did not act on those principles when it mattered, then his words were worthless. He said he knew people, journalists who could not be intimidated, members of Parliament who were already suspicious of Crown overreach, foreign diplomats who would be interested in proof that the British government was developing weapons of mass coercion. He said that if we moved carefully, if we coordinated the release of information so that it could not be suppressed, we might succeed in stopping the project. He said that it would take time, that we would need to build alliances and gather additional testimony, but that he believed it could be done. I asked him what would happen to me. He said that I would need to disappear, at least for a while, until the scandal broke and the Crown was too occupied with damage control to hunt down witnesses. He said he had contacts who could help me leave the country if necessary, who could provide new identity papers and safe passage. He said that survival had to be my priority, because if I was captured or killed, the evidence would be easier to discredit. I told him I did not want to run anymore. I told him I wanted to see this through, to stand up in court or Parliament or wherever they would let me speak and tell the truth about what I had seen. He said that was admirable but dangerous, that the Crown had ways of making inconvenient witnesses disappear. He said that the most powerful thing I could do was stay alive, because dead martyrs were easier to dismiss than living accusers. I understood what he meant. The Duke had died to give me a chance to survive, to finish what we had started. If I threw that away by insisting on a dramatic confrontation, I would be dishonoring his sacrifice. So I agreed. I would disappear. I would let the professor coordinate the exposure. I would trust that the truth, once released, would take on a life of its own. It took 3 months. 3 months of waiting, of hiding, of reading newspapers and searching for any sign that the story was breaking. The professor was meticulous, cautious, building his case the way a watchmaker built a mechanism. He published a series of articles in scientific journals, raising questions about the ethics of cognitive manipulation. He gave interviews to foreign newspapers, speaking hypothetically about what might happen if a government possessed such technology. He testified before a parliamentary committee investigating industrial conditions, mentioning in passing that he had heard rumors of experimental devices being tested on vulnerable populations. By the time he released the full evidence, the ground had been prepared. The story appeared simultaneously in 5 newspapers, 3 in England and 2 in France. The documents were reproduced in their entirety, the contracts and test reports laid bare for anyone to read. The professor gave a public lecture at the Royal Society, demonstrating with diagrams and technical specifications exactly how the cognitive suppression array was designed to function. He named the officials who had signed the contracts. He named the director who had overseen the project. He called for a full investigation and criminal prosecution. The response was immediate and chaotic. The newspapers that had published the story were raided by police, their editors arrested on charges of sedition. The professor was summoned to Parliament and interrogated for 6 hours. Several members of the cabinet resigned. The director of Crown Security disappeared, reportedly fleeing to the continent. Protests erupted in the industrial districts, workers demanding to know if they had been targeted, if their communities had been selected for the experiment. The Home Secretary stood before Parliament and denied everything, called the evidence fabricated, accused foreign agents of orchestrating a campaign to destabilize the government. But the truth had momentum. Other scientists came forward, corroborating the professor's claims. Former employees of the laboratory were located and interviewed, confirming that a device matching the description had been under construction. A journalist discovered the connection between the Duke of Ashvale and the project, revealing that he had been the primary contractor and that he had died under suspicious circumstances at his family estate. The story shifted from a conspiracy theory to a scandal, from a scandal to a crisis. 6 weeks after the initial exposure, Parliament announced a formal inquiry. The laboratory beneath Whitechapel was raided and shut down. The prototype of the cognitive suppression array was seized and dismantled under supervision of independent scientists who confirmed that it matched the specifications in the leaked documents. Several officials were indicted. The project was officially terminated, and new regulations were proposed to prevent similar experiments in the future. I followed it all from a distance, reading newspapers in a cottage on the coast of Scotland where the professor had arranged for me to stay. I read about the Duke, about his life and his death, about the conflicting narratives that emerged as people tried to understand his role. Some called him a hero who had sabotaged a dangerous project from within. Others called him a traitor who had violated his contract with the Crown. A few newspapers suggested that he had been murdered by government agents to silence him. None of them knew the whole truth. None of them knew about the false machine he had built, about the brother he had lost, about the woman he had loved enough to let her go. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to stand up and say that I had known him, that I had worked beside him, that he had been neither hero nor traitor, but something more complicated and more human. But the professor advised against it, said that revealing myself would only invite danger, that the Crown had not forgotten about me, even if they had lost track of where I was. He said that the Duke's legacy was secure, that history would judge him fairly, and that my role was to survive and remember. So I stayed silent. I stayed in the cottage and watched the waves and thought about the man who had waited for me in the steam tunnels with a blueprint in his hand. I thought about his fog-gray eyes and his careful hands and the way he had said my name as if it were a prayer. I thought about the tower room where we had stood together in the rain, about the kiss that had tasted of hope and fear and something too fragile to name. I thought about the moment he had pushed me through the door of the stables, about the sound of gunshots in the rain, about the weight of the valve he had pressed into my palm. I kept the valve. I kept it on a shelf above the desk where I wrote, where I could see it every day. It was a reminder of what we had stopped, of what we had risked, of what he had given up so that I could continue. It was a small thing, no larger than my thumb, made of brass and etched with grooves that had once allowed steam to flow through in controlled bursts. Now it was just an artifact, a piece of a machine that no longer existed. But to me, it was more than that. It was proof that we had mattered, that our choices had consequences, that one person's courage could change the course of history. A year after the scandal broke, the professor came to visit me. He brought news that the inquiry had concluded, that several officials had been convicted, that new laws had been passed restricting government experimentation on civilians. He said that the project was truly dead, that no one would attempt anything like it again for a generation at least. He said that we had won. I asked him what the cost had been. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the cost was always higher than we wanted it to be, but that the alternative would have been worse. He said that the Duke had understood that, had made his choice knowing what it would cost, and that the best way to honor him was to live well and fight for things that mattered. He said that guilt was a burden we could choose to carry or choose to set down, and that carrying it forever would not bring anyone back. I knew he was right, but knowing something and feeling it were different things. I had survived, had exposed the truth, had stopped the machine from ever being used. I had done what the Duke asked of me. But I still woke in the night, reaching for someone who was not there. I still heard his voice in quiet moments, still saw his face in crowds that could not possibly contain him. Grief, I was learning, did not follow the rules of logic. It did not care about closure or justice or time. It simply existed, patient and permanent, waiting for me to make room for it alongside everything else I carried. So I did. I made room for the grief and the guilt and the love that had no outlet. I made room for the memory of a man who had built a false machine to buy time, who had trusted me with the truth, who had chosen my survival over his own. I made room for all of it, and I kept going. I started writing, not just about the project or the scandal, but about everything. About my father's workshop and the precision he had taught me. About the 18 months I had spent in the laboratory beneath the city, drawing lines without understanding what they would become. About the night I burned the blueprint and ran through the steam tunnels and found a man waiting with the truth. About the estate in the rain, the tower where we had kissed, the moment he had pushed me through the door. I wrote it all down, every detail I could remember, because I wanted there to be a record. I wanted someone someday to know what had really happened, to know that he had not died a traitor or a hero, but a man who had loved and fought and sacrificed for something larger than himself. The professor helped me publish it under a pseudonym, in a small journal that specialized in personal accounts of historical events. It was not widely read, but it was out there, preserved, a testament to what we had done and who we had been. I sent a copy to the Duke's sister in Scotland, along with a letter explaining what had happened to her brother. She wrote back 3 months later, thanking me for the truth, saying that she had always known there was more to the story than the newspapers reported. She said that her brother had been a difficult man, proud and stubborn, and often blind to his own faults, but that he had always tried to do what was right, even when the right thing was impossible. She said that knowing he had loved and been loved in return made his death easier to bear. I kept that letter. I kept it with the valve and the documents and all the other fragments of a life that had been interrupted. I kept it because it was proof that I was not alone in remembering him, that his life had touched more people than just me, that he had mattered to someone beyond the scandal and the sacrifice. 2 years after the estate, I left Scotland. The professor had secured a position for me at a small engineering firm in Manchester, one that specialized in industrial safety equipment. They did not ask many questions about my past, and I did not volunteer information. I worked as a technical draftsman again, but this time I drew machines that protected workers instead of controlling them. I drew ventilation systems and safety rails and pressure release valves that kept boilers from exploding. I drew with the precision my father had taught me. But now I understood what that precision was for. It was not just about clean lines and accurate measurements. It was about making choices that mattered, about using skill to build things worth building. I did not remarry. I did not even consider it. There were men who expressed interest, colleagues who asked if I would like to join them for dinner, but I could not imagine standing beside anyone else, could not imagine letting someone else into the space the Duke had occupied. It felt like a betrayal, even though I knew he would not have wanted me to spend my life alone. But grief is selfish, and love does not distribute itself evenly. I had loved him with an intensity that left no room for anyone else, and that was simply how it was. I was not unhappy. I built a life that had meaning, work that mattered, friendships that sustained me. I corresponded regularly with the professor, who continued to advocate for ethical science and against government overreach. I sent money anonymously to organizations that supported workers' rights, that fought for better conditions in factories and mines. I tried, in small ways, to honor what we had started, to make the world slightly better than it would have been if we had stayed silent. On the anniversary of his death, I took the train back to the county where his estate had stood. The house had been sold and partially demolished, the stones repurposed for other buildings, the land divided and sold to tenant farmers. There was no marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate that anything significant had happened there. I walked through the fields where we had run, stood at the edge of the woods where I had heard the gunshots, and I said goodbye. Not to the memory, which I would carry forever, but to the hope that someday the pain would feel different. It would not. And that was all right. Some things were supposed to hurt. Some losses were supposed to last. I stood there until the sun set and the sky turned the color of ash in firelight, the color of his eyes. Then I walked back to the station and took the train home to Manchester, to my small flat and my careful work and the life I had built from the wreckage of the one I had lost. Years later, long after the scandal had faded from public memory, long after most people had forgotten that there had ever been a project or a machine or a duke who died under mysterious circumstances, I received a package. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. Inside was a pocket watch, gold and intricate, with an inscription on the back, "For precision and courage." It was not signed, but I knew who had sent it. The Duke's sister, perhaps, or the professor, or someone else who had known what we had done and wanted me to know that it was not forgotten. I wound the watch and listened to it tick. It was a perfect mechanism, every gear and spring working in harmony, keeping time with an accuracy that would have made my father proud. It was a reminder that some things could be fixed, that broken pieces could be reassembled into something functional and beautiful. It was a reminder that precision was still a kind of prayer, and that the machines we built with care could outlast us. I wear that watch still. I wear it every day, feel its weight on my wrist, hear its steady ticking in quiet moments. It keeps time the way memory keeps truth, relentlessly and without sentiment, marking the passage of moments that become hours, that become years. It reminds me that I survived, that I did what I was asked to do, that the Duke's sacrifice was not wasted. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and the work is done, I close my eyes and let myself remember. I remember the steam tunnels and the blueprint burning, the fog-gray eyes that saw more than they should have, the kiss in the tower room with rain falling outside. I remember his voice saying my name, his hands pressing the valve into mine, the sound of the door closing between us. I remember all of it, hold it close, let it hurt the way it needs to hurt, Because some stories do not have happy endings. Some stories end with sacrifice and separation and the weight of choices that cannot be undone. But that does not make them tragedies. The Duke and I stopped a machine that would have stolen thousands of minds. We exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. We made the world slightly safer, slightly freer, slightly more just. And we loved each other, briefly and fiercely, in the space between fear and hope. That was enough. It had to be enough. And on the days when it felt like it was not, when the grief threatened to swallow everything else, I looked at the valve on my shelf and the watch on my wrist, and I remembered that he had believed I was worth saving. That he had looked at me and seen someone who could finish what he started, someone who could carry the weight of truth and keep going. So I did. I kept going. For him. For the people we saved. For the future we fought to protect. I kept going because that was what love looked like when the person you loved was gone. Not forgetting, not moving on, but carrying them forward into whatever came next. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was its own kind of redemption.